Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Welcome to the Michelle Meow Show at the Commonwealth Club of California, and today's discussion with legendary television director James Burrows. I'm John Zipperer, the club's Vice President of Media and Editorial, and Michelle's co-host for the show. At the Commonwealth Club, we're producing hundreds of programs a year on a wide variety of issues, online as well as many in-person programs. So head over to commonwealthclub.org/MMS for more upcoming programs as well as video and audio of our past events. If you're watching us live on YouTube, add your questions to the chat box and we'll work some of them into our conversation here today. Just a reminder, today's program is part of our Good Lit series, underwritten by the Bernard Osher Foundation. Now here's Michelle Meow. She's the producer and host of the Michelle Meow Show and a member of the Commonwealth Club's Board of Governors. Hello again, Michelle.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you to all of you for joining us for this special program this afternoon. We are in for such a treat. We'll have a great conversation about good TV, great TV. I know you all remember what that is. Well, our guest today doesn't really need an introduction. All I have to do is bring up some of the best TV shows in America, such as Taxi, Will and Grace, Friends, The Bob Newhart Show, News Radio, and many, many more. The list goes on. So here to talk about showbiz and his new memoir is James Burrows, author of Directing James Burrows. James, thanks so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
I think a good place to start is really where the memoir begins, and that is getting to know you before you knew what you wanted to be before you grew up. So let's start with getting to know your childhood, growing up with a father who's also a legend. And we get introduced to your father actually as a radio writer, in which I have to admit, some of us don't actually know what that is. So talk to us about your father and what it was like to grow up with a legend.
It was daunting. And, it was, he was a legend in New York City. We both my sister and I were born in California, and then in like 1945 we moved to New York. My mother and father divorced, and then my dad came after that to do Guys and Dolls, and he was dad to me, but I was trundled along with my sister to rehearsals, and I didn't know what was going on, neither did she. Dad would bring us there an hour before. He would take us to dinner, and we would run around the theater and see these people on stage acting and not knowing quite what it was. So little did I know that he taught me while I didn't know I was learning. He would have great New Year's Eve parties. And, Truman Capote was there, and Cole Porter and John Steinbeck and Betty Comden and Adolph Green and all the literati in New York. But I was, I had no really idea of who they were or, what shows they did. Because I didn't see a lot of theater when I was growing up, and it was mainly my grandmother took me. So he was my dad, and as I grew older, there was no way I was going to go into his business.
You were not right in the book. Of course, your family is Jewish, and you were bar mitzvahed when you were in your 40s. So we should begin by wishing you a good New Year.
Oh, thank you. Lashana Tova.
Shana Tova. So what I found interesting was you said no way were you going to go into stage work. You did end up doing some stage work, but of course then the story really takes off when you get to TV sitcoms. But there's stuff from the stage that you saw and that you were a part of that you do bring to the sitcom. You talk about the live audience. Can you talk about the things you drew from stage work into your sitcom work?
Yeah, after after I graduated from the Yale School of Drama, because I went there in the early 60s because I had a student deferment and didn't have to take my physical. Eventually, I took my physical, and I was let go because I think I was too funny. And I started by stage managing, assistant stage managing, and then as a stage manager, you get to direct the understudies. So I got the sense of what directing was, and then watching my father, I saw him. And what I eventually did in television is it's a film, a stage play. I do theater. I'm a theater rat. I was brought up in the theater. I know theater. I love opening nights. And every Tuesday or every Friday when we shot a show, it was opening night for me. So all my upbringing was perfectly right for the form that I went into. In fact, I was directing a production of 40 Carats with Joan Fontaine in Wallingford, Connecticut, and turned on the TV one Saturday night, and there was the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And I looked at it, and they were doing 20, 22, 25 minutes in a week, and I was doing a 2-hour play in a week. And I said, I can do that. And if you read the book, you know I had a connection with Mary Tyler Moore, a very deep connection on the first show I ever worked on. And so I wrote her a letter, and they brought me out to California and to do one show. That was 1974. And, the rest is history. But I will say I was bar mitzvahed in my 40s. But because if you ask a 13-year-old kid, a 13-year-old Jewish kid, do you want to be bar mitzvahed? They're going to say no. You can't ask them. You got to say. So my parents, who were kind of agnostic, just said that. And I said no. So the Charles brothers, who created Cheers with me, said that I was the only man they knew that was bar mitzvahed at 47 and lost his hair at 13.
Many of us in the, especially in the LGBTQIA plus community, I mean, you bring up Mary Tyler Moore. A big question is, what was she like? And share more stories of Mary Tyler Moore and exactly kind of what your job was, especially right, like the first gig, Breakfast with Tiffany's.
Well, I was the assistant to the assistant stage manager on Breakfast at Tiffany's, a musical based on the Truman Capote book or novelette, I think they call it, that my father wrote. And it was not Abe's best work, but they cast Mary Tyler Moore and Dick Chamberlain as the leads. So you had Laura Petrie and Dr. Kildare, who were two huge television stars back then, and people from California. So I was in charge of the two of them, making their life easier, making sure they had their lunches, making sure they knew their lines. I ran lines with them, making sure they knew when they came off stage that they had to change. So I was like the liaison between them and the production. And the show went out of town. It did a lot of business, big business, because of the two people. But David Merrick didn't like the show, so he fired my dad. And I said to my dad, "Is it okay if I stay on the Titanic?" And he said, "Sure." So I stayed on. They brought in Edward Albee to rewrite my dad, not your major musical comedy person, and Joseph Anthony to direct. So I stayed on, and rather than go back out of town, we previewed New York, and the show opened on a Monday night in New York, previews, and we were hooted off the stage. The audience hated us. And so when I was waiting in the wings for Mary to come off, she would come off and throw her arms around me crying. It was just the worst experience for her. So David decided to close the show after 4 previews, which was the Wednesday night. And I sat with her at Sardi's at the wake and waited until Grant Tinker, her husband, came from California. And so Mary and I formed this bond of we had this relationship at the core. So when I did write a letter to her, she knew who I was. She knew my work. I had run a theater in San Diego for a couple of years. And so she gave me the opportunity to do one show, and she was great. In fact, the show, just before we shot the first Mary Tyler Moore I ever did, first show I ever did, she came over to me and said, "We feel our investment in you has worked out." So she was, in essence, my champion. And, she took a risk. They took a risk on hiring me. I had not done any TV, and I had to spend 4 months learning the technical aspects of it, which is the camera work, how to cover the show, because you have 3 cameras rolling simultaneously. So you have to know, you have to get all the comedy and all the shots. And so they were wonderful with me. And Grant, after they divorced, he and I became good friends. Unfortunately, Grant passed away about 5 years ago. And they were wonderful to me.
You do talk in the book about that kind of training period and on the job, watching other directors do shows, and that other directors were brought in in the same way at the MTM shows. Was that normal for sitcoms work, or was that kind of a Mary Tyler Moore Productions unique approach?
No, I think it was normal. I don't think, John Rich, who did All in the Family, I don't think he did them all. I think other people did them. And the resident director is the guy, John was the resident director, but he didn't do all the shows on All in the Family. And Jay Sandrich, my dear mentor, who unfortunately passed away earlier this year, a wonderful man who took me under his wing. And I was eternally grateful to him for all the help he gave me and what he taught me. He did 75% of the Mary Tyler Moore shows. So they had some, he kept them they had a working relationship. When a new director came in on that show, there was some testing. Yes, there was testing of the new director. But if you played by the rules of the show, you were accepted. And that is something that Jay taught me. And that is something I did. And now I set the rules of the show. So it's a lot different. But back in those days, you had to play by the rules of the show and not worry if you're going to be asked back next week. You had to put some stuff in there and create some stuff and make stuff funnier to really succeed.
I kind of want to follow right up on that, because you're both talking about the resident director and you talk a lot about the right chemistry on the set and among the cast and on the staff and all that. But you also touch on your one stint directing a Laverne and Shirley, and why you were asked to do more and why you said no. Could you tell us a bit about that?
I was hired because of my reputation on the Mary show. I was Gary Marshall, because Gary Marshall and Jim Brooks were close, and all the comedy writers were close, even though they worked at different entities. And so Gary brought me over to do Laverne and Shirley. I did about, I did 10, total of 10, and I had a great time with Cindy and Penny, and David and Michael, and Eddie Mecca and Phil Foster, who knew my dad, and Betty Garrett, who I'd worked with before. And I really liked doing the show, but there was always tension on that show. And Gary Marshall took me to lunch at Oblast, which was off the Paramount lot, and he asked me if I wanted to become the resident director, and I said I had to pass. I had other avenues to explore, but I didn't want to be. There was a lot of tension on that show that I didn't want to be a part of. So that's why I passed on that.
Just to go back to your dad very quickly, you'd mentioned earlier about, especially before you knew what you wanted to be before you grew up, not wanting to get into the industry. I wanted to ask about eventually getting into the industry, but how your relationship with your father may have changed over time. You do mention your father's alcoholism and, early on in the memoir. And so wanted to ask, kind of Yeah, share with us how your relationship with your father changed over time, especially as your career progressed.
Uh, so, my dad did have problems with alcohol early on, but eventually he gave it up in the 70s. And he was sober for like 15 years till he died. It was, since we lived with my mom, we didn't see it as much. We'd go to dinner with my dad, but both my sister and I knew, and our stepmother would tell us that. And when my dad saw me work, he came out to see a Bob Crane show that I did in 1975, maybe. But at that time, he was starting to have the beginning effects of dementia. And he was very sweet. He was very complimentary. And then, he saw the beginning of Cheers. And I didn't think, he didn't see the success on Cheers. He did see the success on Taxi. But on Cheers, which was my first show that I had control over with the Charles brothers, my dear friends, he didn't really see that. He did see the pilot, and he called me and he said, "I wish the bartender had more dirt under his fingernails." And I kind of understood what he meant, because Teddy was not an athlete, not at all. He was a farceur from Carnegie Mellon. I took him to his first baseball game. I had we hired Fred Dreyer to be on the show, so as a sportscaster, so Teddy could see what a peacock Fred was. So because Sam Malone is a peacock, so all that stuff. So my dad was right, and unfortunately, he passed in 1985, and really didn't see, wasn't aware. I mean, Cheers won the Emmy the first year, but my dad was not in a good mental state, so he didn't see that. So it's the one regret. I wish he could have seen my success as I saw his.
You were certainly a success before Cheers came along, but Cheers was just kind of stratospheric once it hit. So take us into, you mentioned the Charles brothers, or the brothers as you call them in the book. Tell us how that came together and the formation of Cheers.
The Charles brothers and I were on Taxi. I was the resident director and they were the producers. Believe it or not, we met before on the Phyllis Show. They were story editors on the Phyllis Show. So I had met them there, but I got to know them on Taxi, which was probably the most difficult show I ever worked on, and for them too, because we had Jim Brooks was doing a movie the first year, and so he wasn't around all the time. And then Ed was there, was a wonderful writer, but he had certain ideas and Jim had other ideas. And Ed would put his ideas in and then Jim would come and change them. It was all for the better of the show, but it was difficult to work. And I had to deal with that. Plus I had to deal with Taxi being the first 4-camera film show. Mary Tyler Moore and Newhart and Laverne and Shirley and Happy Days were all 3 cameras, three film cameras rolling simultaneously. Taxi, because the set was so big and there were 7 major characters, we added a 4th camera so I could get more of the original the first time we shot it. I could get more reactions and more, I could get the jokes more easily having more cameras. And then the set was huge, which was another reason we needed 4 cameras. And then I had an interplanetary cast. I had people from, different walks of life. I had theater rats like Judd and Mary Lou and Danny and Chris Lloyd. Danny and Chris Lloyd were in Cuckoo's Nest, and Mary Lou was in Breeze. And then I had a boxer, Tony Danza. And then I had, people call him a comic, but Andy Kaufman was a performance artist. So it was difficult to try to mold these people into the homogeneous group that I like. I like my cast to love one another. And because if they love one another, that'll transmit across the screen. So it was difficult. We finally got there midway through the first year. Because everybody had, different things. Andy Kaufman had day-night reversals. So as a comic, he would stay up performing and writing till 5 a.m. So Andy didn't have to come in until 1 o'clock, and people in the cast resented that. I didn't, because that's what you had to do to make the show work. So, and there was also dealing with Andy's alter ego, Tony Clifton. And so it was a really difficult show for me, and I think difficult for the Charles brothers too.
Whose idea was it to bring in Christopher Lloyd and his character of Reverend Jim?
Well, it was an episode in the first year where the writers decided they wanted to have Lotka get married so that he could stay in the country. Lotka was Andy Kaufman, who was the mechanic. So in order to do that, they had someone to perform the ceremony. So I think Bobby Wheeler, Jeff Conaway's part, knew of this guy, Reverend Jim, who was not a drug addict. He was drugs had ruined his mind, but he didn't do them anymore. That's the only way we could get away with that character. But he was a child of the 60s. So I was there for Chris Lloyd's audition, and he walked in the room in the same outfit he wore in the show. We didn't provide it for him. That was his outfit. And every day he came to rehearsal in the same outfit, never changed it. And I thought, whoa, this guy's a little freaky. Until Friday night after we shot the show, because we had so many young kids on that show, they always had a party upstairs. And Chris Lloyd showed up at the party with a nice white shirt, tapered jeans, and cowboy boots. And I knew it was all an act. But it was one of the extraordinary characters on television.
You also described Taxi as challenging for a lot of reasons. Share with us why.
Yeah, because as I said, it was difficult to, get that cast to pull we're all in a rowboat and we're rowing. I'm the coxswain, rowing through the stormy seas. And it was difficult to get everybody to row together. But eventually, through guile and psychology, everybody came aboard. And it was one of the funniest shows I ever did. I did, I think, 75 of them, because I left in the fourth year to do a movie. And then in the fifth year, I did Cheers. So it was just difficult, because it was also my first really coming out show. I was never a resident director before on any show. And this was the show that I was the resident director on.
I just wanted to follow up very quickly. There's a line in the memoir, though, that I deeply connect with, which is you found it difficult also because telling the stories of taxi cab drivers and then connecting that back into the show. I had never thought about, I guess, cab drivers in this way. And there was something that you also wrote about how making characters extremely relatable, even though they're fictional characters.
Yeah. You need to get your audience to identify with the characters. So they have to have vulnerabilities. They all, in Taxi, they all had vulnerabilities. The one major vulnerability that all of them except Judd Hirsch had was they all aspired to get out of the garage. They all had dreams. In the pilot, Judd, the character of Alex, says, look over there. She's an art dealer. That's a boxer. That's an actor. I'm the only one who's a cab driver here. They all had aspirations to get out. So that was the vulnerability that they all had. You knew they weren't going to get out. you knew Ralph Cramden was never going to succeed in anything he tried. He will always be a bus driver, but that's his frailty. And so that's important. And so all those characters had that, and that's how you get an audience in. That's how you draw them in.
So after Cheers and after that one movie, after Taxi and that one movie, you do Cheers. So how did Cheers come about, and how did you go about constructing it with the brothers and kind of crafting that more, I should say, molding kind of the world of the characters and their setting?
So after the third year of Cheers, the Charles brothers and I had the same agent, a man named Bob Broder, who's so powerful that he's only referred to as Broder, and sometimes Darth Broder when he really gets mean. He said, you guys should do a show. So NBC, who was now being run by Grant Tinker, he knew about us because the Charles brothers started at MTM too. And they gave us a deal to do a show. And so the Charles brothers and I sat around for a long time discussing what the show would be. And we were big fans of Fawlty Towers. And we thought about doing a show about a hotel. And then we thought maybe the main part, most part, that show would take place in the bar of the hotel. And maybe we don't want to do a hotel. Maybe we want to do a show about a bar. And we talked about a bar in Barstow, California, halfway to Vegas, because you get all the types, the weirdos going there and the people coming back, some stars, who perform there. You could do that. And then since all three of us were huge sports fans, we said, let's do a sports bar. And then when we decided on that, we decided it had to be in a rabid city. So we talked about either Philadelphia or Boston, because New York there are a lot of shows set in New York, especially, and since he'd just come off Taxi. So Glenn Charles was visiting Boston, and he was doing location work, and he wandered into the Bull and Finch, which was downstairs. And so he found the locale for the bar, and then we talked about the characters. And, we did a lot of research. We went to bars. We went to a lot of bars in LA. There are not a lot of those kind of bars that are in Boston. The bars in LA are a lot different. And so we wanted to do the other thing special with that show is we wanted to do an evolving relationship. We wanted to do a Tracy Hepburn relationship, and we wanted it not to stay in the same place. We wanted it to evolve. So we had these characters, Sam and Diane, and originally when the boys went off to write it, Diane Chambers was a woman who Sam worked for, a very tough woman in the Suzanne Plachette vein. And when I came back from a vacation, the script was on the table, was on my doorstep, and I read it, and it was amazing. And I called them and I said, you brought radio back to television, because it was so literate. And they created the character of Diane Chambers. And we had talked about character of Norm, because everybody knew a Norm in the bar. There's one, just one more on my way home. Those guys. We talked about Coach, an old player that Sam used to have. We knew about Rhea Perlman, so we created the character of Carla. And so we wrote the script, and NBC loved it. And the rest is 11 years of history.
It was just such an amazing show, and it's a show that you take away one of the central characters when Shelley Long leaves the show. It would have been a surprise that show lasted, in the normal sitcom world, if it lasted another 2 years, but it thrived for another 6 years. Were you worried about making that shift, or was this like, okay, here's a chance to do something else we wanted to do with it?
Yeah, we were scared out of our shot glasses. We were, because Sam and Diane drove the show. People would ask me, well, what's happening with Sam and Diane and stuff like that. And, we knew they were the juggernaut. So when Shelley said she wanted to leave, we were devastated. It was, we didn't quite know what to do. So we thought about it, and we decided to go back to the first permutation, which was Sam working for a woman. So the boys went off again and wrote the script and came back with the script. And when we told our casting director, Jeff Greenberg, we want Sam working for a Suzanne Pleshette type, first words out of his mouth were Kirstie Alley. And none of us knew her. I didn't know her personally, but I knew she had worked in front of an audience because I had seen her do Cat on a Hot Tin Roof at the Mark Taper Forum out here, a theater out here. And she was amazing. So I knew she had the gumption for that. And, we saw her, and she came in to read, and she read with Rhea and Teddy. And Teddy came up, they came up after to discuss it, not Kirstie. We let her go. And Teddy said, I want to hug her. And we thought that was interesting because that was not the intent of the character. So we then we waited a couple of months, started writing scripts because Kirstie had auditioned in right after the season 5 had wrapped. So that was in May and June that she auditioned. So we did the first show, and we had written her as a martinet, a really strict, tough woman. She came in, and Teddy had the great line when he first met her, when he goes "boo-ah," because that's not what he's expecting of the person. And she was just mean, incredibly mean to him. And it wasn't the first 2 days, it wasn't really working. And we didn't quite know why. We didn't, we kind of forgot that Teddy said, I want to hug her. And so the rehearsal of this end of the second day, Kirstie has to go into her office. And because it was Sam's office, but it became her office, and she now was running the bar. She goes to her office, and she turns, the knob doesn't work. She's very strident. She said, I have to go to my office and work, and the knob doesn't work. So all of a sudden she goes, it's not working. It's not working. So all of a sudden that opened our eyes. We said, oh my God, this is a woman who thinks she's tough, but she's a puff guy, powder puff on the inside. So the rest is history, because we used that, and we made a definite choice not to have, when Shelley left, not to have another waitress, and Sam not to be in another relationship, although he pursued, and it was, just for laughs. But, we got lucky. We got the right person. We were very lucky on that show. When Nikki passed, unfortunately, at the end of year 3, we were then in the schedule of following Family Ties, and we said, we're not going to go older, we're going to go younger, because the breakout character of Family Ties was Michael J. Fox. So we wanted we went younger. Woody came in for his audition. He blew his nose. That was the first thing he did. Everybody started laughing. And then we were lucky enough to get Bebe Neuwirth, who Glenn Charles had seen at Upstairs at the Downstairs, and knew about her as Frasier's, relationship. So we were incredibly lucky on that show. And It doesn't always happen, but we ran 6 years with Kirsty and only 5 years with Shelley. And also you got to see, because Sam and Diane were not driving the show, you got to see how dynamite the rest of the cast was. Johnny and George and Kelsey and Bibi and Rhea and it just was, and Woody getting married, and it was amazing.
John wasn't joking before the program began when he shared that we could talk to you for hours. I mean, he said 6 hours, but I do want to get into some other mega shows, one particular that changed the world, and another script that you said, was so good. I mean, it was so good at the time. You didn't have time to direct it, but you knew that you had to. And so that show, many people know as Friends. Talk to us about Friends and, the science behind it. Why the show really, I think, changed people, but also people love it. People never forget it. People continue to love it, and so on.
I had nothing to do with the creation of that show. It was written by Marta Kauffman and David Crane, and it was sent to me at the end of pilot season of 1994. And I read that script, and it was just amazing. In fact, that pilot script, from what I read to what was on the air, was 95%. I didn't know that at the time until I went back and found I had an old copy of the pilot, and I read the pilot, and 95% of what was on that page from the original script ended up as being the pilot of the show. It was smart. It was literate. It told 3 stories in a half hour rather than 2. It's casting. I use an example of how much luck is involved in casting, because those 6 people were available at the end of pilot season of 1994. So that'll tell you how much luck is involved with the right actor being available at the right time for the part that comes along that he's right for or she's right for. And I only did 15 shows, but I would have done more, except I had a production company at that point, and I had to do the shows that were coming out of the production company. I would have done more because I love the kids. I love the writing. The writing on that show was genius. And it took 9 years for the Academy to realize it and give them an Emmy. Because in the beginning, when that show started, people didn't like it. That people were saying, "Oh my God, it's Generation X. They're just pretty people." They didn't realize how gifted actors they were and how comedic actors they were and how genius the friggin' writing was. And I've bitched about this it'll be 30 years in 2024, because that show was just brilliantly written. And I loved working with the kids. I'm still friendly with them. They still call me Papa. I put my stink on them when I did the show. I did the first 4 shows, and I maybe did 8 shows the first year, and then I did a few other shows. I did the Prom Video, which is one of people's favorites, and I've always maintained contact with them and the writers too. And it's just a show that will keep appealing to young people. That's what drives the audience. And as the people who started watching that show in 94 are now parents, and their kids are watching the show. So it's an endless cycle because it holds up. The one thing it doesn't hold up is the fact that nobody sits around and talks anymore, because if you have 6 people in a coffee house, they're all on their phone. On Friends, they had to relate to one another. The phones were, I think there were car phones then, but they were like shoes, huge shoes with a aluminum stick sticking out of them. So, that's and the stories are universal on that show. So I only did 15, but people always say, God, I love Friends. I love that you created that show. I didn't create that show. That show was created and sent to me, and I somehow put my stink on it and somehow enabled that cast. They came together rapidly. They grabbed the oars in the boat and they rowed almost from the first show. And they were in tandem. They loved one another. They helped one another. They had incredible suggestions when I worked with them that only made me look better. So I had a great time.
I want to jump ahead of them to another show that was groundbreaking. And that, of course, is Will and Grace. So how did you first get involved in that? And what made you think this show is not only something you want to be involved in, you directed every single episode of that show, both the original run and when you upped in the 20 teens. So how did that come about for you?
It was, the script was sent to me by Warren Littlefield in 98, I think late 97. And it was his idea. Max Muchnick and David Cohen had written a pilot for them that didn't work, but they had 3 different couples in the pilot. And one of the couples was Will and Grace. So I think Warren told the boys, why don't you go write a series about these 2? So the script was sent to me and I loved it. And I wanted to do it. And I took the boys to lunch. And when I take people to lunch, they think they're auditioning me, but nah. I'm auditioning them because I want a writer to defend his material, not be defensive about it. So we hit it off, and the pilot, the episode was through the roof. The test audience we had 3 days before we shot it loved it. And the show, when we shot it, loved it. And I wanted a kiss at the end of the show. Will and Grace kiss at the end of the show, because I wanted, because I knew that 25% of the country wouldn't watch the show because of the characters. It was a situation comedy that happened to have two gay characters. And I knew that would turn off 25% of the country. But I thought if it was so funny, I thought if I could get people just to watch, maybe 10 minutes of the show, they'll see how funny it is and they'll hook into it. And we put a kiss at the end of the first episode between Will and Grace. There was, thinking, maybe the audience is thinking, well, maybe Will become a straight man and marry Grace. Never in our heads, but it was, it was out there. So, and we never, the 3 of us, Max, David, and I, we never thought about proselytizing at all on that show. Again, it was a sitcom that happened to have 2 gay characters. And we never did. Occasionally, we did a show about conversion therapy, or a show where Will got so upset with Jack, he called him a fag. And so it was the relationship of 2 boys, how they dealt with it. But it was never a proselytizing show. And we never set out to change the world. We like to say Ellen kind of opened the door and we came through and busted it wide open. And I didn't know how much of effect that show had until I was on Thursdays, which was the night that Will and Grace was on. I would drive carpool for my 13-year-old daughter. And I would pick up, 3 other kids, and we'd be on their way to school. And invariably, one of the kids would say to me, "What's on Will and Grace tonight?" And I knew that this show was being watched by kids before they had a precondition of what there, of gay people. And I thought to myself, wow, this is something that I had no idea would happen. Neither did the boys. And, then when Joe Biden came out and said we had done more to promote the gay agenda than anybody else, I was incredibly, I'm trying to think of, I was shocked and incredibly flattered that came out, because we never set out to do that. We set out to do a funny show. We like to say we did a fairy tale, literally and figuratively. We did a show with jokes that broke the television screen. The laughs were so big by 4 characters who you could have never done those jokes on other shows.
You had called Will and Grace one of your most proudest moments of your career. And I'm listening to you talk about, what it's done, right? Like for LGBTQIA plus people. And now thinking about where we're at in pop culture, but also politically, how do you feel about, the jokes that landed, the stories that were told? I feel like in today's time, it might be a little bit more sensitive, I guess, is where I'm trying to go. Do you feel that there's been, a change in that if you could share with us the creative process behind it, if you ever got stuck, or how you get unstuck, if you ever felt like you were in a more of a political situation than you were creating a really good script or really good TV?
Well, when we first started the show, gay rights isn't where it is now. It's come a long way now. And so we were dealing with different things back then. There were a lot of people who weren't aware of it. And so by dint of the show, people became more aware of it. And now, as with the reboot, it didn't do as well because the agenda isn't the same. The gay people are more accepted now, and when it first happened, it was equally as funny in the second incarnation as it was in the first incarnation. And I think the stories were better because it was stories about older people, especially older gay people, Will and Jack, and the loneliness maybe, and what's involved with that. But I guess by dint of the reboot, it probably wouldn't work if we rebooted it again, because it doesn't carry the same cachet that it had back in when we originally started.
I sometimes think along Michelle's lines that, so one of the shows I've watched during the pandemic was the entire run of MASH. I also watched all of Cheers, but specifically MASH. And I'm thinking Alan Alda's Hawkeye character would so be Me Too'd today that show ran today. Well, okay. So last night, after reading in the book your remarks about the 2 live episodes of Will and Grace that you did, I watched them on Amazon Prime, and they were absolutely delightful. They're wonderful. But as you know, this was a new thing for you. You've obviously, though you've directed for TV as if it were a stage show, having it all live was a bit of a high wire act for you. Talk about that. How did it go? And did it feel that way through the whole thing? Or was it just once you had to get it started, then you were like, okay, I know what I'm doing?
It was really difficult because on an ordinary production of Will and Grace, you shoot the show with 4 film cameras and then you edit it. So, you can edit out the mistakes and you can lose the bad shots and everything like that. But on this show, there's no editing. I'm doing the editing live. I'm snapping the show, which means when I snap my fingers, I can't do that anymore. So I have a clicker, look like a frog. So when I click, the the technical director pushes a camera and that camera comes on, so the audience is seeing my live cut. So it was very difficult for me because I was not trained that way. And what I had to do was rehearse the show over and over and over again until it became rote for me, so that I knew what shot was coming next, but I could also, know that there's going to be a laugh there. So I don't want the technical director cutting, because he has a script too, and he sees cut at the end of a line. I don't want him cutting necessarily on that line. I want him waiting for, staying on the person who said the joke to wait and then cutting away. So it took me on both shows, both live, Will and Grace, it took me a while to get out of my uncomfortable zone. And then I didn't even, later on, I even did myself more trouble by doing the live shows for Norman Lear, which were an hour, 2.5 hours that I had to do. And if, I was sweating bullets, but I had a great assistant director and a great TD. And again, I had to run those shows over and over and over again to get familiar with them, so I knew when to cut.
Big question for you as we wind down. And again, we could spend hours and hours talking about all the great shows you've worked on. Your thoughts on TV today?
Here's
I wasn't expecting a short answer, by the way.
Oh, well, here's how I like to describe it. And it applies not only to comedy, to drama and reality and everything like that. When I started out, there were 3 networks and 30 great comedy writers. Now there are 500 networks and 30 great comedy writers. So everything is spread so thin now. People are doing shows that haven't learned how to do them, haven't spent time apprenticing, writing on shows, and then coming and doing their own shows. It takes a while. It takes a while to do it. So you don't have to appeal to the 26 million people that Cheers appeal to every week. You don't have to do that. You have to appeal to 50,000 people, 500,000 people. You could do a really specific show about, doctors who were born in Iowa who play golf and go to the movies and are married to blonde girls. You can find that specific niche and do a show about that. You'll get 10,000 viewers. And on some network, on some streaming services, that's good. So it's changed. It is changed. There are still big hits, but there's not as many as there used to be. And the numbers aren't what they once were.
One show we've passed over a number of them, but one was, of course, Frasier, the long-lasting spinoff from Cheers. And around the time it was winding down, I remember reading some TV critic who praised it, saying it was something like one of the last adult sitcoms. And he didn't mean adult in sexual ways; he just meant adult and it was they didn't aim for the lowest common denominator. They were doing serious stuff, as you've mentioned a few times in the book about being willing to write above where the audience might be and not worry about that. So I guess I'm kind of turning this also to Michelle's question, is just like could, in this world of streaming and 500 channels and all that kind of stuff, is one of those niches or one or more of those niches for a sophisticated adult comedy?
I mean, Larry's show, Curb Your Enthusiasm, is a sophisticated adult comedy. I mean, it's his own show out of his own head, and he doesn't care if some people don't get it or anything like that. There's a market for it. It's not as big a market as it was before, but there's a market for it. That character of Frasier Niles. You know, Frasier became Sam Malone on Frasier, and Niles became Frasier. You don't want to write down. You want to write up. And, you know, it's the same thing that happened on The Big Bang Theory. I mean, Jimmy Parsons playing Sheldon would say stuff that nobody understood, but you knew the intent. And again, on Cheers with Diane, you knew the intent. With Frasier, you knew the intent. And I think there's a market for shows like that. I just don't know why people aren't making them anymore. And, you know, the sitcom is, you know, there's only 3 or 4 of them. The Neighborhood and the Conners, which I love, and Call Me Kat is a live action, you know, situational comedy. But I don't know why people are not making them anymore.
There are many shows, again, that we could sit and talk about. So please pick up a copy of Directing James Burrows. I think that, you know, brings us back to what we love about sitcom television, and at the same time, all these stories, James, that you tell in the book, I very much appreciate. On that note, you know, to write a memoir, you know, why now? After so many successful shows and so many stories built, and I'm guessing that there are many stories that you left out.
Yeah, there are some on the tawdry side. But, you know, I had a lot. My wife's been begging me to write a book forever because and I keep telling these stories and people keep laughing, and she's tired of hearing them. So she said, put them in a book where people can read them so I don't have to hear them anymore. And so COVID hit and nobody was working. And she said, if you don't call your agent, I will. So I called my agent. He hooked me up with a literary agent who hooked me up with Eddie Friedfeld, who was my ghostwriter. Well, not a ghostwriter. He's on the front page where he should be. And I started telling stories. And he was very inquisitive. And as I told stories, more occurred to me. And, we sat and we crafted this book. And, you know, there's some instructional stuff in the book, how some of the camera work I do, and it's rudimentary, but it's meant as a primer for those who maybe want to go into the business. But, the stories from my dad and what he taught me and stuff like that it was great to put it down. And I'm getting very good reaction, especially from my wife.
One of our viewers posted on the YouTube chat. She says, my mom was married to Dave Davis, Dobie Gillis era, and I tracked the work you did together for years on many shows from MTM through Taxi. What a powerful team you created. What were the gifts of that?
Well, Dave Davis, to go back to when I first met Dave Davis, was in 1964. I came out to work on a pilot my dad was doing called OK Crackerby, which starred Burl Ives. And I was brought out, I was brought out to work on it as Burl Ives' dialogue coach. And Dave Davis was the associate producer. So I met him there. And when I came out to California to work out for MTM, which was in 1974, the first person I met was Dave Davis, who was then co-created the Newhart Show. So he and I, he was great with me. His dad was a wonderful comedy writer, Phil Davis. And Dave taught me a lot. And again, we went our separate ways. And then he was on Taxi for a year. So I got to meet him there. So, David is one of those highbrow, great writers of comedy and a wonderful man in the editing room. Incredible with that. And I learned so much from him.
Well, I can't believe it, but we have burned through an hour, so I think we have time for a couple of our last questions. So I will ask mine. What are you currently tuning into? What are you watching right now?
I'm a huge sports fan. I'm a New York Yankee, New York Giant fan. So yesterday was a bad day for me because they both lost. So that's why I'm so grim right now.
Oh,
We watch a lot of streaming stuff. As I said, I watch Curb and I watch The Conners. That's the network stuff I watch. But I watch, we just got done with Gaslit, and Breaking Bad is my favorite all-time show ever. I got to meet Vince Gilligan once, and he's he's from Virginia. He's got a little bit of Southern accent. I never expected that. We watched Dope Sick, and we watched Ozark, because I tuned in originally because Jason Bateman, who I've worked with a number of times, the show was Ozark, it had a K in it. I thought it was a funny show. And boy, was I disappointed. But I loved watching it. And that's what I watch. Blasphemy, I haven't seen The Crown. I watched a couple of years of Sopranos, never finished it. So people hate me for that, but hey, hate me.
Okay, so then what's next on your plate? Or do you have programs lined up you're going to be shooting that you can tell us anything about?
I'll wait till pilot season. I did a pilot in March that didn't go. And there's supposedly Norman Lear and Brent Miller are going to do another live show. So maybe in March, and then I'll look for a pilot. But other than that, I'm kind of semi-retired. Semi-retired is such a weird word. It sounds like you put your truck away, doesn't it? It just occurred to me. So I play golf, and I read as much as I can, and I try to exercise every day. And that's it. So I have nothing on the horizon.
well, James, thank you so much for taking time out and chatting with us about directing James Burrows. Like I said, if you don't have a copy, you haven't read it yet, you should. And one of the things I love about the book also is what James said. There's some stuff in there that he offers for, well, I guess if you get the book, it's not necessarily for free, but the intellectual property part of it all, which I think so many of us if you do want to break into the industry, there's things like that about, character development, building characters, relationships, and how that all comes together in a TV show. So make sure you all pick up your copy. And John, I'll give you the last words.
Well, thank you again to our special guest on today's program, James Burrows, author of Directed by James Burrows. Last but not least, thanks to all of you watching or listening to this program. You can find more programs at commonwealthclub.org. Stay safe and have a good rest of your week. Goodbye.